Magician's Nephew, Part 2. Chapter 3. The Wood Between the Worlds. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then, for a moment, everything became muddled. The next thing Digory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above, and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. I believe I'm in water, said Digory, or underwater. And this frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upward. Then his head suddenly came out into the air, and he found himself scrambling ashore out onto smooth, grassy ground at the edge of a pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed that he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect after, being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side, and they were in a wood. The trees grew close together and were so leafy, that he could get no glimpse of the sky. All the light was green light that came through the leaves, but there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for this green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just, got out of, it was not the only pool. There were dozens of others. There was a pool every few yards, as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it afterward, Digory always said it was a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that almost before he had looked about him, Digory had half forgotten how he had come there. At any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly, or Uncle Andrew, or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened, or excited, or curious. If anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he would probably have said, "I've always been here." That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he had said long afterwards, it's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing, and that's all. After Digory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just between sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing, and at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time. She also said nothing. Then she spoke in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Digory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. At least, I don't know, a very long time. Oh, so have I, said Digory. No, you haven't, she said. I've just seen you come up out of that pool. Yeah, I suppose I did, said Digory with a puzzled air. I'd forgotten. Then for quite a long time, neither said any more. Look here, said the girl presently. I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head of a boy and a girl like us, living somewhere quite different and doing all sorts of things. But perhaps it was only a dream. Well, I've had that same dream, I think, said Digory, about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling among the rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face. Oh, aren't you getting it mixed up? In my dream, it was the boy who had the dirty face. I can't even remember the boy's face, said Digory, and then he added, Hello, what's that? Why, it's a guinea pig, said the little girl. And it was. It was a fat guinea pig, nosing about in the grass. But around the middle of the guinea pig, there ran a tape. And tied onto it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. Look! Look! Cried Digory. The ring! And look! You've got one on your finger, and so have I. The girl now sat up, really interested at last. They stared very hard at one another. They were trying to remember. And then, at exactly the same moment, she shouted out, Mr. Ketterly! And he shouted out, Uncle Andrew! And they knew who they were, and they began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes of hard talking, they had got it straight. Digory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. But what do we do now? Said Polly. Take the guinea pig and go home? There's no hurry, said Digory with a huge yawn. Oh, but I really think there is, said Polly. This place is too quiet. It's so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, I think we shall just lie down and we'll drowse forever and ever. Oh, it is very nice here, said Digory. Yes, it is, said Polly. But we've got to get back. She stood up and began to go cautiously towards the guinea pig. But then she changed her mind. We might as well leave the guinea pig, she said. It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will just only do something horrid to it if we take it home. Yeah, I bet he would, answered Digory. Look at the way he treated us. By the way, how do we get home? Go back into the pool, I expect. They came and stood together at the edge, looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green, leafy branches. They made it look very deep. We haven't any bathing things, said Polly. Oh, we shan't need them, silly, said Digory. We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember? It didn't get us wet on the way up. Can you swim? A bit. Can you? Well, not much. Oh, I don't think we shall need to swim, said Digory. We want to go down, don't we? Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither said so to the other one. They took hands and said, 1, 2, 3, go! And they jumped. There was a great splash, and of course they closed their eyes. But when they opened them again, well, they found they were still standing there, hand in hand, in that green woods. And they were hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool, apparently, it was only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry ground. Well, what on earth's gone wrong? Said Polly in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it is hard to feel really frightened in that wood. The place is just too peaceful. Oh, I know, said Digory. Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left pocket. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you. They put on their green rings. They came back to the pool, but before they tried another jump, Digory gave a long, "Oh! What's the matter?" said Polly. I've just had a really wonderful idea, said Digory. What are all the other pools? Huh? How do you mean? Why, if we can get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, well, mightn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a world at the bottom of every pool. But I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world, or other place, or whatever he called it. Didn't you say? Oh, bother Uncle Andrew, interrupted Digory. I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the guts to come here himself. He only talked of one other world. But suppose there were dozens. You mean this wood might be only one of them? No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it's just a sort of in-between place. Polly looked puzzled. Don't you see? Said Digory. No. Do listen. Think of our tunnel. Think of our tunnel under the slates at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses. In a way, it isn't really part of any of the houses. But once you're in that tunnel, you can go along it, and you can come out into any of the houses in the whole row. Mightn't this wood be the same? It's a place that isn't in any of the worlds. But once you've found that place, you can get into them all. Well, even if you can, began Polly, but Digory went on as if he hadn't even heard her. And, of course, that explains everything, he said. That's why it is so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here like at home. It's in the houses that people talk and do things and have their meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places, behind the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor or even in our own tunnel. But when you come out of our tunnel, you may find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into, well, jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up by, or not just yet. The wood between the worlds, said Polly dreamily. It sounds rather nice. Come on, said Digory. Which pool shall we try? Now look here, said Polly. I'm not going to try any new pool till we've made sure that we can get back by the old one. We're not even sure if it'll work yet. Yes, said Digory, and get caught by Uncle Andrew and then have our rings taken away before we've had any fun. No thanks. Well, couldn't we just go part of the way down into our own pool, said Polly, just to see if it works. And then if it does, we'll change rings and we can come up again before we're really back in Mr. Ketterly's study. Can we go part of the way down? Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it will take time going back. Digory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in the new worlds until she had made sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he was about some dangers, wasps, for instance, but she was not so interested in finding out things nobody had ever heard of before. Now, for Digory was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up, why, he became the famous Professor Kirk, who comes into other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings. Green for safety, said Digory, so you can't help remembering which one is which. And hold hands and jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back to Uncle Andrew's study, or even to their own world, Polly was to shout, "Change!" and they would slip off their greens and put on their yellows. Digory wanted to be the one who shouted, "Change!" but Polly wouldn't agree. They put on the green rings. They took hands, and once more they shouted, 1, 2, 3, go! And this time it worked. It is very hard to tell you what it was like, for everything happened so quickly. At first, there were bright lights moving about in a black sky. Digory always thinks these were stars, and he even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moon. But almost at once, there were rows and rows of roofs and chimney pots all about them, and they could see St. Paul's Cathedral, and they knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls. You could see through the walls of all the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted, "Change!" And they did change, and our world faded away just like a dream. And the green light above grew stronger and stronger until their heads came out of the pool and they scrambled ashore. And there was the wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. "There," said Digory, "that's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one." "Stop," said Polly. "Aren't we going to mark this pool?" They stared at each other, and they turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Digory had just been about to do. For there were any number of pools in the wood, and the pools, well, they all looked alike, and the trees were all alike, so that if they had once left the pool that led to our own world without marking some sort of landmark, the chances would have been 100 to 1 that they would ever find it again. Digory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife. He cut out a long strip of turf on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was of a rich reddish brown and showed up very well against the green. "It's a good thing one of us has some sense," said Polly. "Well, don't keep on gassing about it," said Digory. "Come on, I want to see what's in one of the other pools." And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it all down. So let us just skip on to the moment at which they stood, with beating hearts and rather scared faces, on the edge of the unknown pool, with their yellow rings on. And they held hands, and once more said, "1, 2, 3, go!" Splash! Huh? Once again, it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet. They splashed their legs for the second time that morning. If it was a morning, it seems to be always the same time in the wood between the worlds. "Blast and botheration!" exclaimed Digory. "What's gone wrong now? We've put our yellow rings on all right." He said yellow for the outward journey. Now, the truth was that Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between the worlds, had quite a wrong idea about those rings. The yellow ones weren't outward rings, and the green ones weren't homeward rings. Well, at least not in the way that he thought. The stuff of which both were made had all come from these woods. The stuff in the yellow rings had the power of drawing you into the wood. It was stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings, well, that is stuff that is trying to get out of its own place, so that a green ring would take you out of the woods and into a world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Digory did not realize the truth quite clearly either, or not until later. But when they had talked it over, they decided to try their green rings on the new pool, just to see what happened. "I'm game if you are," said Polly. But she really said this because in her heart of hearts she now felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of than having another splash. I am not quite sure that Digory had not the same feeling, but at any rate, when they had both put on their greens and come back to the edge of the water and had taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and a little less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go! Said Digory, and they jumped. Chapter 4. The Bell and the Hammer. Now there was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness, and then through a mass of vague and whirling shapes, which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter, and then suddenly they felt that they were standing on something solid. A moment later everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. Oh, what a strange place, said Digory. I don't like it, said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't like sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light or lamps or candles or any other light they had ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful. It was steady and did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in a sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. And when you had seen that sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. It's very funny weather here, said Digory. I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse. I don't like it, said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers. And though there was no reason why they should still go on holding hands, after their jump, they didn't let go. The walls rose very high all around that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly like the mouths of a railway tunnel. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and the sharp corners were all worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled up with rubble. The two children kept on turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason was that they were afraid of somebody or something looking out of those windows at them when their backs were turned. Do you think anyone lives here? Said Digory at last, still in a whisper. No, said Polly. It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came. Well, let's stand still and listen for a bit, suggested Digory. They stood still and they listened, but all they could hear was the thump, thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, and it was full of life. Oh, this was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't even seen anything yet," said Digory. "Now we're here, we simply must have a look around." "I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting here." "Well, there's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them when you've got there." Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Digory's hand. I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place." "I'll go anywhere you go." "Well, we can get away the moment we want to," said Digory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is to remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You can keep your hand as near your pocket as you like, but don't put it in, or else you'll touch your yellow and you'll vanish." They did this, and they went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways, which led into the inside of the building. And when they stood on the threshold and they could look in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they had first thought. It led into a vast, shadowy hall, which appeared to be empty. But on the far side, there was a row of pillars with arches between them, and through those arches there streamed in some more the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches. They found themselves in another and larger courtyard. That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall over into the courtyard. In one place, a pillar was missing between two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar ought to have been just hung there, with nothing to support it. Clearly, this place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years. "Well, if it's lasted until now, I suppose it'll last a little bit longer," said Digory, "but we must be very quiet. You know, a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps." They went on out of the courtyard into another doorway and up a great flight of steps and through vast rooms that opened out of one another, till you were dizzy with the mere size of this place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and to see what sort of country lay around this enormous palace. But each time they only got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places when people were still living there. In one there had once been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could still see a bit of piping at the back of its mouth, out of which the water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was as dry as a bone. In other places, there were the dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant, which had wound itself around the pillars and helped to pull some of them down. But it had died long ago, and there were no ants or spiders or any of the other living things you expect to see in a ruin. And where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstones, there was no grass, no moss, It was also dreary, and all so much the same, that even Digory was thinking they had better put on their yellow rings and just get back to the warm, green, living forest of the in-between place, when they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold. One stood a little ajar, so of course they went to look in. Both started back, and they drew a long breath, for here at last was something worth seeing. For a second, they thought the room was full of people, hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Digory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a good long time, looking in. But presently they decided that they were looking they couldn't be real people. There was not a movement, nor the sound of a breath among them all. They were like the most wonderful waxworks you ever saw. This time Polly took the lead. There was something in this room which interested her more than it interested Digory. You see, all the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help but going in to see them closer. And the blaze of their colors made this room look not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the others. It had more windows, too, and was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe the clothes. The figures, well, they were all robed, and they had crowns on their heads. Their robes were of crimson and silvery gray and deep purple and vivid green, and there were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts in needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness all stared from their crowns and hung in chains around their necks and peeped out from all the places where anything was fastened. Why? Why haven't these clothes all rotted away long ago? Asked Polly. Magic, whispered Digory. Can't you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in. Well, any one of these dresses, they would cost hundreds of pounds, said Polly. But Digory was more interested in the faces. And indeed, these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on each side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and look at the faces in turn. They were nice people, I think, said Digory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and women looked kind and wise, and they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that looked a little different. These were very solemn faces. You felt you would have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. When they had gone a little further, they found themselves among faces they didn't like. This was about the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they looked cruel. A little further on, they looked even crueler. Further on again, and they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy either. They were even Well, they were even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting, a woman, even more richly dressed than the others, very tall, but every figure in the room was taller than the people of our world. She had a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away. Yet she was beautiful too. Years afterward, when he was an old man, Digory said he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. It is only fair to add that Polly always said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. This woman, as I said, was the last. But there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. I do wish we knew the story that's behind all this, said Digory. Let's go back and look at that table sort of thing in the middle of the room. The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch, from which there hung a little golden bell. And beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder, said Digory. Hey, there seems to be something written here, said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. By gum, so there is, said Digory. But of course, we won't be able to read it. Oh, shan't we? I'm not so sure, said Polly. They both looked at it hard, and, as you might have expected, the letters cut in the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found they could understand them. If only Digory had remembered what he himself had said just a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was becoming to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar, and very soon they both knew. What it said was something like this. At least this is the sense of it, though the poetry, when you read it there, was much better. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wander till it drives you mad. What would have followed if you had? No fear, said Polly. We don't want any danger. Oh, but don't you see it's no good, said Digory. If we can't get out of it now, we shall always be wondering what else would have happened if we had struck the bell. I'm not going home to be driven mad by always thinking of that. No fear. Don't be so silly, said Polly, as if anyone would. What does it matter what would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this is bound to go on wandering till it sends him dotty. That's the magic of it, you see. I can feel it. I can feel it beginning to work on me already. Well, I don't, said Polly crossly, and I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on. That's all you know, said Digory. It's 'cause you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged." "You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that," said Polly. "Oh, why can't you just keep to the point?" said Digory. "What we're talking about is—" "How exactly like a man," said Polly in a very grown-up voice. But she added hastily in her real voice, "And I don't say I'm just like a woman, or and don't you say I'm just like a woman, or you'll be a beastly copycat." "I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman," said Digory loftily. "Oh, I'm a kid, am I?" said Polly, who was now in a real rage. "Well, you needn't be bothered by having a kid with you any longer. I'm off. I've had enough of this place, and I've had enough of you too, you beastly, stuck-up, obstinate pig." "None of that," said Digory in a voice even nastier than he meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand moving to her pocket to get a hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next, except by saying that he was very sorry for it afterwards, and so were a good many other people. You see, before Polly's hand reached her pocket, he grabbed her wrist, leaning across her with his back against her chest. Then, keeping her other arm out of the way with his other elbow, he leaned forward, picked up the hammer, and he struck the golden bell a light, smart tap. Then he let her go, and they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing hard. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear, and not even because he had hurt her wrist quite badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels quite out of their minds. You see, as soon as the bell was struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note, such as you might have expected, and not very loud. But instead of dying away, it went on, and as it went on, it grew louder. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was soon so loud that if the children had tried to speak, but they weren't even thinking about speaking now, they were just standing there with their mouths open, they would not have heard one another. Very soon, it was so loud they could not have heard one another even by shouting. And still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till all the air in that great room was throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise, which sounded first like the roar of a distant train, and then like the crash of a falling tree. They heard something like great weights falling. Finally, with a sudden rush and thunder and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet, about a quarter of the roof at one end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all around them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped. The clouds of dust cleared away. Everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to magic, or whether that unbearably loud sound from the bell just happened to strike the note, which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. "There, hope you're satisfied now," panted Polly. "Well, it's all over anyway," said Digory. and both thought it was. But they had never been more mistaken in their lives.